Chapter 3. What was left unsaid? There is a particular kind of silence that does not feel empty. It feels deliberate. It sits between sentences in a way that ordinary silence does not. It lingers after explanations have finished, long after the words have stopped, like the air pressure after a door closes in a room you did not expect to be sealed. It leaves a trace, not of what was said, but of what was carefully navigated around. And once you become attuned to it, you cannot hear anything else. By the end of both interviews, the New York Times in December, Oprah in March, I was no longer listening for what was being shared. I was listening for what was not. The information was present. The emotional detail was present. The architecture of explanation was sophisticated and largely coherent. But something sat beneath it like a low frequency, just outside the register of ordinary listening, not loud enough to name in the moment, persistent enough to stay. This chapter is about that frequency, about omission, what it is, how it works, why it matters, and about what specific things were not said across several hours of public testimony by one of the two people at the center of one of the most watched viral moments in recent memory. It is also about what the absence of those things tells us, and what it means for the story that is still, in every meaningful sense, unfinished. The shape of an omission. Omission is widely misunderstood. The common assumption is that it is passive, that it simply means something was left out, accidentally or through oversight. But omission in the context of a prepared, managed, media-trained public narrative is none of those things. It is active. It is a selection. It is, in the most precise sense, a structural decision about what the audience will carry forward and what they will not. Omission does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a visible gap you can point to and say, "There, that is what is missing." It is far more sophisticated than that. It shows up in the architecture of emphasis, in what is returned to, expanded, given emotional weight, circled back to with care, and it shows up just as clearly in what is mentioned once, briefly, and then allowed to recede. Because when something genuinely matters to a speaker, they stay with it. They do not move past it in a single clause and then pivot to something else. They sit in it, they name it from different angles, they let it cost them something in the telling. When they don't, when a thing that should be heavy is handled lightly, when a name that should be spoken is kept at the level of pronoun, when an impact that should be acknowledged is present only as implication, the omission takes shape, not as a hole in the story, as a contour around something that is being protected. In literary criticism, there is a concept sometimes called the significant absence, the thing whose presence is felt precisely because it is not there, the negative space that defines the positive shape. Cabot's interviews had several of these, and the most significant is the one this book has already named, but which deserves to be named again, more fully, in its own space. The woman whose husband was in that VIP section, whose marriage may have been built on a representation that was not true, whose name was never spoken across several hours of public testimony. Megan Kerrigan Byron, not mentioned once. What was repeated, and what that tells us to understand what was omitted, you first have to understand what was not omitted, what was present in abundance, what received time and emotional weight, and the specific kind of careful articulation that signals, "This is what I need you to understand." The fear was present, vividly, specifically present. 50 to 60 death threats, 500 calls a day, strangers driving past the house in New Hampshire like a motorcade. The children were present, their terror named, their vulnerability made real, their innocence invoked as both evidence of harm and moral anchor. The career loss was present, the unemployment, the speaking circuit that now had to substitute for the work that was no longer available to her, the bitter asymmetry between her continued exposure and Byron's relative recovery. The humiliation was present, the dissection of her appearance, the reduction to a meme, the way her face had become a cultural shorthand for a particular kind of caught. These things were not only mentioned, they were revisited, they were expanded, they were returned to from different angles, and they should have been. Those experiences are real, and they are serious, and a woman who received death threats and had her children terrorized deserves to have that documented clearly. But repetition does something powerful in narrative. It centers. It tells the audience, through the sheer weight of return, that this is the primary experience of the story, that this is where the moral gravity lives, and when the primary experience being centered is the speaker's own suffering, while other suffering remains peripheral, unnamed, and structurally absent. The moral geometry of the story shifts in ways that feel natural but are not neutral. Repetition is not decoration, it is argument. And what was argued persistently and with considerable skill across both interviews was this: the greatest cost of what happened at the Coldplay concert on July 16, 2025, was borne by Kristen Cabot. This argument was never stated. It was structured, and structure in public narrative is often more powerful than statement, precisely because it operates beneath the level of conscious disagreement. What was not returned to? And then there were the things that appeared once, mentioned in passing, acknowledged with the minimum of engagement that still technically counts as acknowledgement before the conversation moved elsewhere and never came back. The nature of the relationship itself. The dynamic between a CEO and the woman who reported directly to him, who was responsible for the company's human resources function, whose professional role was literally the protection of employees from exactly this kind of power arrangement. This was present in the interviews. Cabot did not deny the reporting relationship, did not deny the title or the structure, but it was not sat with, it was not unpacked. The question of what it means to develop a romantic attachment to your direct superior or to cultivate one with your direct report within a company you both led, this question was not explored with anything approaching the emotional depth with which her fear and her children's distress were explored. The timeline. When, specifically, did the feelings develop? How long before the concert had what Cabot describes as a crush become something more than that? 5 days before the concert, she says, they had a lengthy lunch to discuss disclosure and restructuring. But the feelings that required that disclosure, how long had those been present? And during that time, what did the people whose lives were structured around the assumption of fidelity in these marriages, Andy Byron's wife, Cabot's estranged husband, their children, know or not know, and what was the effect of not knowing? The disclosure plan. Cabot described it carefully. 5 to 6 days before the concert, a plan was made. They would go to the board together. They would disclose. They would restructure the reporting lines. It was presented as evidence of good faith, proof that transparency was always coming, that the camera on the Jumbotron simply caught the moment before the plan could be executed. But the plan was never interrogated. When had it been made? If feelings had been developing for months, as the emotional intimacy of their shared disclosures over lunch implies, why had the plan to disclose not been made sooner? And why, in the aftermath, when the disclosure effectively happened involuntarily on a stadium screen to 300 billion people, was the plan not discussed publicly in terms of what it had cost the people it had not yet been executed for? The wife who learned about it on the Jumbotron. The family who found out from the internet. These are not rhetorical questions designed to condemn. They are the questions that a genuinely accountable narrative would have engaged with. and their absence, their presence as shapes that could have been filled but were not, is what this chapter is trying to name. Omission is not neutral. There is a sentence from the introduction to this book that belongs here because it is the foundation of everything that follows. Omission, especially in a moment of public explanation, is active. It is a decision, a selection, a shaping of what the audience will carry forward. This needs to be expanded because the resistance to this idea is real and understandable. The counter-argument goes something like this: no one can say everything in an interview. There are time constraints, emotional limitations, things that cannot be spoken for legal reasons, things that are simply too painful to navigate publicly. A person should not be condemned for what they chose not to say. This is fair, and it is not what this book is doing. What this book is doing is something different. It is noting that the specific pattern of what was and was not said across multiple interviews, across multiple platforms, across 8 months of careful public engagement is consistent. The omissions are not random. They do not point in multiple directions. They point in one direction, away from the people who are not in the room and toward the speaker's own experience of loss and harm. That consistency is not coincidence. It is architecture. When you guide interpretation, when you decide what people will remember and what they will not, when you structure a story so that sympathy flows in one direction and accountability recedes in another, you are making choices with consequences. The consequences are not just for you. They are for everyone whose experience of the same events has been shaped by your telling. The wife who never told her story, the children who were never mentioned, the women who watched the interviews and noticed quietly that the person who had been closest to their husband was now on Oprah talking about her own suffering, and that the word sorry, specifically addressed to the people most directly affected, never came. Omission shapes what people believe happened, and what people believe happened determines whether justice, real justice, not the mob version, not the internet version, but the quiet, structural, moral kind, is ever possible. The weight of what remains hidden. There is something specific that omission creates beyond the gap itself. It creates tension. Not the loud, obvious tension of contradiction, not the tension you feel when someone says one thing and then another that does not match. It is quieter than that. It is the tension of incompletion, the feeling a listener carries when a story has been told in full sentences with clear structure and genuine emotion and still does not land. Stories that are fully told land. They have a particular quality of settlement, a sense that even if the content is difficult, the account itself has weight and integrity. You walk away from them carrying something solid, even when that thing is uncomfortable. Stories that are not fully told hover. They linger in a way that settled stories do not. They leave the listener with a residue, not of anger necessarily, not even of suspicion, but of unresolved question, a sense of something still in motion, something not yet arrived. By the end of the Oprah interview, that hovering was what remained. The content had been substantial. The emotional detail had been real. The new information, Byron's alleged dishonesty, the astronomer advertisement, the full horror of the harassment, had been significant. And still, something had not settled, because the story, for all its length and emotional range, had not included the things that would have made it whole. The name of the woman whose life it had most directly disrupted, the acknowledgement of the children who were not Cabot's own, the word sorry directed not at the circumstances or the exposure, but at the specific people who had been harmed by what happened before the camera found them. Without those things, the story does not land. It hovers. And hovering stories have a particular fate in the internet age. They do not go away. They accumulate. When the story protects itself. There is a moment in every public explanation, every interview, every statement, every carefully prepared account, where the story either opens or protects itself. The difference is not always obvious from the outside. Both look like speaking. Both involve vulnerability, exposure, the discomfort of being seen. But they feel different. A story that opens takes risks. It says things that do not serve the speaker. It names people who have not been named. It sits with the hardest part of the account rather than moving past it. It allows the weight to distribute itself according to what actually happened, rather than according to what the speaker needs to be understood as having endured. Opening looks like discomfort. It sounds like a voice that has not been rehearsed into smoothness. It carries, somewhere in it, the quality of something that could not be entirely controlled. A story that protects itself looks complete. It sounds reasonable. It is emotionally compelling and structurally coherent and entirely on the right side of the question it has chosen to answer. But it has selected the question carefully. It has answered, with great fluency and genuine feeling, the question it could answer while leaving the other questions, the harder ones, the ones that would require acknowledging a different kind of cost, in the space where the unasked questions live. The Cabot interviews protected themselves, not crudely. There was nothing cynical about them, and there is no reason to believe the pain was performed. But the story, across both tellings, never stopped protecting what it most needed to protect. The version of events in which Cabot is primarily the person to whom things were done, rather than also a person who, along with someone else, did something to people who had no say in it. Once you see that protective structure, you cannot unsee it. It does not make the pain less real, but it changes what you understand the pain to be doing in the story. The difference between telling and revealing. Not all telling is revealing. This is perhaps the most important distinction this chapter makes, because it is the one most easily collapsed by the defense of someone who has spoken publicly and at length. The defense goes, she spoke, she gave multiple interviews, she went on Oprah, she answered questions, she shared things that were painful and private. She told the story. What more could she have done? The answer is not more detail. It is not more hours of interview, more platforms, more emotional disclosure. The answer is revelation, and revelation is categorically different from telling. You can tell a story in full sentences, with clear structure, with genuine emotional weight, across multiple platforms over the course of 8 months, and still not reveal what matters most. Because revealing requires something beyond clarity. It requires a willingness to let the story stand without the architecture of protection. It requires saying something that does not serve you. It requires, in the most precise sense of the word, surrender. Not to the audience, not to the internet, not to the mob that was cruel and disproportionate and wrong in its methods, even when it was not entirely wrong in its instincts, but surrender to the full truth of what happened. Telling keeps control. Revealing relinquishes it. What the Cabot interviews offered was telling of an unusually high quality. Articulate, emotionally intelligent, strategically sophisticated telling, but not revelation. And the gap between the two, the specific, consistent gap in a particular direction, is what this chapter has been tracing since its opening sentence. The instinct we are taught to ignore. There is something many of us are taught, explicitly or by cultural osmosis, to distrust. Instinct, the quiet sense that something, even when it sounds entirely right, does not feel complete. The feeling that arrives before you can articulate why, before you have assembled the evidence or identified the omission or named the gap. Just a frequency beneath the words, a sense that the account and the truth are adjacent but not identical. We are taught to override this, to trust the structure, the language, the confidence of delivery, to give the benefit of the doubt when someone is articulate and clearly suffering, to feel that doubting a person in pain is a form of cruelty. But instinct does not respond to performance, it responds to truth. And when truth is partial, when it has been shaped and selected and guided and managed, instinct notices, even when it cannot immediately explain why, even when the explanation takes months or a book to assemble. The women who watched the Oprah interview and felt something was missing were not being cruel. They were not engaging in the same mob logic that sent death threats. They were engaging in something much older and much quieter, the recognition of a pattern they had seen before, in smaller rooms, in private moments, in the specific way a story can be told that protects the teller while asking those harmed to absorb the cost of that protection. That recognition deserves to be honored, not dismissed as cynicism. Because it is not cynicism, it is clarity. The cost of partial truth. A partial truth is not the same as a lie. It is more complicated than that, and more difficult to hold people accountable for, which is precisely why it is the preferred instrument of managed narratives. It does not trigger the clear moral response that a lie triggers. It does not allow the wronged party to point and say, "That is false, that is incorrect, that is demonstrably untrue." Instead, it leaves them with something harder to name, a sense that what they received was not enough, without being able to specify the precise quantity of what was withheld. But partial truth has consequences that are as real as the consequences of outright falsehood. It leads the listener to a conclusion, in this case, to the conclusion that Cabot was primarily a victim, that the deepest harm was done to her, that the story's moral center is her suffering, without giving them everything they would need to arrive at that conclusion honestly. It shapes perception, it guides empathy, and it does so in ways that the listener cannot fully assess because they are working with the information they have been given, not the information that exists. The person most damaged by partial truth, in the long run, is the person who offers it. Because the internet does not sleep. Because stories that are incomplete do not remain incomplete. They attract the missing pieces, the way incomplete structures attract attention. Because every time a new detail surfaces, every time someone speaks who has not yet spoken, every time a timeline is examined more closely, every time a question is asked that the managed narrative did not anticipate, the partial truth is not augmented, it is undermined, and the credibility that was so carefully built across multiple platforms and multiple interviews is eroded not by the critics, but by the incompleteness itself. This is the real cost of partial truth, not exposure, not judgment, erosion, the story that is still waiting. By the end of both interviews, what I was left with was not anger. I want to be precise about this, because anger would be simpler and cleaner and easier to dismiss. Anger says, "She is bad, she should be punished, the mob was right." I do not believe any of those things, and this book does not argue any of them. What I was left with was something more uncomfortable than anger. Anticipation, the specific, restless sense of a story that has not yet reached its end. Not because more drama is required, not because there needs to be exposure or revelation or comeuppance in the tabloid sense, but because stories that are fully told settle. They have a quality of completion even when they are painful, even when they are unresolved in the way that life is unresolved. And this story, for all the words that have been spent on it, across all the platforms and interviews and think pieces and memes, has not settled. It is still in motion. There is a person at its center whose name has not been spoken in public testimony. Megan Kerrigan Byron, who deleted her Facebook account in the hours after the concert went viral, who has not given a single interview, who has absorbed whatever she is absorbing in the silence that the interviews Cabot gave have, paradoxically, deepened. Every time Cabot speaks, every time the story is reopened, the wound summoned back, the attention redirected, the silence on the other side becomes more conspicuous. Not because silence is guilt, but because in a story where one person has had every platform available to her and has still left the most important things unsaid, the silence of the person who had no platform at all carries enormous weight. Her story is still waiting, not on a jumbotron, not on Oprah, not anywhere visible. But it is there, in the way that all untold stories are there, as a shape beneath the surface of the version that has been told. Waiting, perhaps, for a moment when it can no longer be managed, or simply waiting for someone to notice that it has never been given the space it deserves. What the internet will find. Let us be practical for a moment, because this book is not only a moral argument, it is also a document of how information moves in the world we actually live in, and that world has specific mechanics that the managed narrative did not fully account for. The internet does not sleep. This is the signature line of this book, and it is not a metaphor. It is a description of how information ecosystems function. Gaps in public narratives are not preserved as gaps. They are filled by journalists, by investigators, by people who knew the people involved, by estranged friends and former colleagues and individuals with documents, by the simple passage of time that loosens what careful management had held in place. The question is not whether the missing pieces will surface. The question is when and in what form, and whether the person whose narrative they will complicate is ready for that surfacing or not. Cabot is on a speaking circuit. She is building a platform. She is, by her own description, working on changing narratives. All of this means that her public profile is not receding. It is expanding. And an expanding public profile in the context of an incomplete public narrative creates a specific kind of vulnerability. Every new audience she reaches is an audience that will eventually have access to the pieces that were left out. Every speaking engagement is a context in which someone in the room will know something. Every interview that is given is an interview that will, eventually, be placed alongside the parts of the story that have not yet been told. This is not a threat. It is a description. The internet that found two people on a jumbotron in 15 seconds is the same internet that is, even now, in the months between those interviews and the publication of this book, filling in the gaps. It always does. And stories that are incomplete when they reach this internet do not emerge from it complete. They emerge complicated, questioned, and harder to inhabit than they would have been if the whole truth had been offered from the beginning. And if this is everything, there is one more possibility that must be named because intellectual honesty requires it. What if this is everything? What if nothing material has been omitted? What if the sense of incompletion is not evidence of omission, but simply the irreducible complexity of a situation that does not resolve cleanly? Because life, and particularly the life of people caught in situations not entirely of their own making, does not resolve cleanly, this possibility deserves genuine consideration. It is possible that Cabot told everything she knows. It is possible that Byron's alleged deception means she does not have the full picture either, that she is also working from partial information, that the story she told is the whole story as she understood it. But even in this possibility, something remains. Because the question of what was omitted is not only a question about facts, it is a question about acknowledgement, and acknowledgement does not require information you do not have. It requires only the willingness to center the people most affected by what happened, to name them, to address them, even in the absence of certainty about exactly what they experienced. I do not know everything about what Megan Kerrigan Byron has been through, but I know that my choices and the choices of someone whose honesty I had relied on affected her life in ways she did not choose and could not control, and I am sorry for the part I played in that. That sentence requires no information Cabot does not have. It requires only a willingness to expand the frame of the story beyond the self. That sentence was never said. Not in the New York Times, not on Oprah, not in any public context that has reached this book's attention. And its absence, incompleteness as much as in incompleteness, is the omission at the heart of everything. The question that does not go away. And so the question remains, not loud, not dramatic, not the question of a person looking for ammunition or resolution or the satisfaction of exposure, just persistent, quiet, with the specific quality of persistence that belongs to things that are genuinely unresolved rather than merely unaddressed. Is this everything? Because if it is, if what was offered across 2 interviews, multiple hours, the most prominent media platforms in the world, is the complete account, then what becomes clear is not that something was hidden. It is that something was not seen, that the person telling the story did not look at the whole of it, did not expand the frame to include the people whose names should have been spoken, did not ask of herself and of the story she was building the question that genuine accountability always asks: who else was in this? And if it is not everything, if there are pieces still in the background, still waiting, still protected by the management of a narrative that has been carefully constructed over 8 months and 2 major media platforms, then what has been offered is not transparency. It is the performance of transparency. And the difference between those 2 things is not academic. It is the difference between a story that has been told and a story that is still being told in the parts that have not yet been heard. Either way, the question does not go away. It simply waits, as all unfinished stories do, for the moment when what was carefully managed can no longer be. The internet does not sleep, and neither does the truth.